Hello, hello. Thank you so much for tuning in to Audio Unicorn once again. Today I thought I will discuss something that I'm actually quite often asked about, and I know this can be a huge progress stopper for many podcasters or people who are thinking to start a podcast, namely, how do you choose a name for a podcast? Now, there is a ton of almost like conspiracies saying that, the name is everything. With a good name, you can achieve everything, climb the mountains, be the best podcaster, and so on. So I thought I will put my couple of pennies in here, and I actually am going to be maybe controversial and say it probably doesn't matter as much. I mean, a podcast name is probably most relevant, first of all, to the podcaster. I think, okay, so let me just retract a little bit here. I think name is important, okay? Of course it is important, but it's not going to make or break your podcast, which means that if you are totally procrastinating over starting a podcast because you haven't got a perfect name, then that's probably the wrong reason to procrastinate over with, and you should just get over it and just do something special there. So I've got my phone here with me, and I thought I will have a quick look at the top 10 podcasts in iTunes, and just see if there is any kind of pattern, and is there something that perhaps indicates that the name is the key in here. So here they go. This is shows in the UK. So I just went into browse and top charts. So the top, this is the top 100 chart in the UK. All right. So number 1, Over My Dead Body. Number 2, David Tennant does podcast with ... Number 3, Shagged, Married, Annoyed. Number 4, Wonder Woman. Number 5, The Joe Rogan Experience. Number 6, Happy Place. Then it's The Intelligence, The Best of the Chris Evans Breakfast Show, Desert Island Discs, George Ezra and Friends, Conviction, Tech Talks, My Dad Wrote a Porno, Deliciously Ella, Off Menu with Ed Gamble and James Acaster, The Dropout, Love Stories, and so on. A huge mix. And it's a mix of pretty much anything and everything. There's one that's called No Such Thing as Fish. That made it to top 20. Name is pretty much kind of, it's important. Of course it's important, but I don't think this is the success factor that many podcasters add so much weight to. And I think that the name should be perhaps straightforward, easy to write and remember. So if especially if you have international audience, then you want to make sure it's easy for them to remember the name and write it down, because that will make it easier to share. So I would definitely steer clear from making up words that nobody knows how to pronounce. That's a huge no-go. It will be a nightmare to then do any social sharing, or if you are appearing on podcasts, every single time you will have to spell it out, which is just not good. Then, yes, avoid names that could be mistaken for something else. For example, my name is Isabella, spelled Izabela. But when I say my name to somebody, they can write it down in literally 100 different ways. It could be Isabella with an S. It could be Isabella with 2 L's, 1 L, with an A at the end, with an E at the end, with nothing at the end. It's like literally like that. So avoid names that create confusion. I think that's a crucial here. Now, what is very important, and you should check it before you lock the name of the podcast. First of all, check that nobody else is using that name, and not only for a podcast, but also for other things. A simple Google search will solve that for you. Number 2, if you can, get a domain. It's increasingly more difficult to get a .com domain, and I think that's predominantly why so many really strange names are coming up in the podcasting world, simply because people want to get the domains, and, things like cooking podcast is going to be definitely taken. So search for something that you can get a .com domain. I am a huge fan of .com. I think it's important to kind of straightforward. I know there are so many other extensions, but you have to think big with what you do. and you want to avoid issues along the way. So if you can, getter.com. Check if the social media handles are not taken. If a social, if say, for example, you wanted to go for an audio unicorn, then check can you get a website? Can you get a Twitter, at Twitter? You just want to avoid the issues of somebody else using it for other things. And, you have to think big. If your podcast grew to hundreds of thousands of listeners, would you be making yourself injustice by having complex social handles? So have a think about that too. I still think that there is plenty that you can find in terms of availability. You can be creative. I don't think that, as I've demonstrated in the top 20 podcasts, I think that literally just a handful of them were actually clear to understand from a podcast name as to what they are about. So, don't get obsessed about it. I also think that you should keep it relatively short. I mean, I've worked with podcasters who have such a tremendously long podcast names. They are just hard to remember. They are less memorable, in my personal opinion, and less it's just... I have a real issue with remembering people's names, and I know I'm not the only one. And it's not just people's names, but also names in general. And when something is really, really long, I find it even harder to remember. And that's exactly what you want to avoid. You want to avoid people like me not remembering your podcast name. So so when it comes to choosing the right podcast name, make it meaningful to you. And if it will be meaningful to you, it will become meaningful to your audience. Make it simple and easy to remember. Make it absolutely straightforward with no potential misspelling opportunities. And most importantly, do not procrastinate over launching a podcast because you haven't got a perfect podcast name. Gather a group of friends and family, put together a concept to them as to, hey, I'm planning to create a podcast that is about this, that, and another. What do you guys think about the name? And have a short list of 10 different names, share them with a group of at least 10 people and see what feedback you are going to get. Sharing it on social media is a great way to get feedback. And that experience doesn't have to be a lone one. It doesn't have to be just you masterminding it. I think it's nice to share it with people you trust. It doesn't have to be open to the public. It can be literally just people you trust, and get feedback, because quite often when we have an idea, we sit in this little tight bubble in our head and we find it hard to get over it. So best of luck with everything. And if you are struggling with a podcast name, let me know. I will be happily your sounding board, and I will give you feedback on what could sound good. So best of luck, and thanks for tuning in.